My name is Susan Carter. And at 68, I thought I had built a life full of love, family, and a home that held every memory of my husband and sons. That morning, though, everything I believed about my own home shattered in a single sentence from my son, Jason. I remember the words as if they had struck the air with a knife. He told me not to argue with his wife in her house. Her house. Not my house. Standing there in the kitchen, I had poured decades of my heart into, my hands still holding the dish towel. I felt the walls closing in. Every corner of this home told a story of laughter, of birthdays, of the smells of cinnamon rolls and chicken soup. This was the place I had sung lullabies, wiped scraped knees, and watched my boys grow into men. And yet, in that moment, it no longer felt like mine. I remember the way Jason's eyes had hardened. A stranger wearing the face of my child. He wasn't the boy I had nurtured to kindness and respect. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. Behind him, Laura stood silently, her smirk quiet but triumphant. I understood then what had been building quietly for months. This wasn't just a disagreement over garden pots or curtains. This was a shift. Sople at first, then undeniable. My son, who I thought would always defend the values I had taught him, had let someone else define the rules of our family home. I froze, heart pounding, mind racing through 35 years of memories. I asked myself how it had come to this. Why my efforts, my sacrifices, my late nights and long days had suddenly been invisible. The unfairness stung. But beneath the anger, I felt a deeper awe. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet of being overlooked in the place you built with your own hands. Even as the weight of reality pressed down, a small, stubborn part of me began to stir. I realized that standing there in shock was no longer enough. I had to find a way forward. Even if it meant confronting the unthinkable. This was the first moment I understood that reclaiming respect and dignity might demand action. And that it would not be easy. I kept my hands steady on the counter, taking a breath, feeling the cool tile beneath my fingertips. The house was still mine, not just the walls and windows, but the memories, the love, and the strength I had woven into it. And I knew, even before the day was over, that I couldn't let anyone, no matter who they were, erase that from me. Looking back, I realized that every brick, every nail, and every brushstroke in this house carried a piece of my soul. My husband, Tom, and I had started from almost nothing. A small patch of land filled with rocks and weeds. I remember his excitement. The way he looked at that empty lot like it held all the possibilities in the world. We lived in a tiny trailer for the first few years, making do with a little gas stove and secondhand furniture. Even then, I felt hope. Hope that one day this land would hold laughter, love, and a home built by our hands. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. During the day, I cleaned houses and sewed for clients. At night, I baked pies to sell at the Sunday market. There were nights my hands bled from scrubbing floors or kneading dough. And yet I felt a quiet pride in every ache. Each sacrifice, each long hour, brought us closer to the dream we shared. It wasn't just a house we were building, it was a life. When Jason was born, I remember holding him in my arms, feeling a mix of wonder and responsibility. He had Tom's smile, soft and patient, and in his tiny hands, I saw a reflection of the future we hoped to nurture. A few years later, Ethan arrived, and suddenly our small world overflowed with energy, laughter, and even chaos. Muddy shoes trailed across the floors, spilled milk on the counters, and tiny hands painted the walls with the colors of childhood. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. Then tragedy struck. Tom died suddenly in a work accident while the boys were still young. I thought my world had ended. But when I looked into the frightened eyes of my children, I knew I couldn't crumble. I sold whatever I could, worked double shifts, and kept going, swallowing my grief so they would feel safe. There were nights I went to bed hungry so they could eat. Nights I cried quietly on the porch while the wind whispered around me. But I held on, because giving up would mean losing not just a home, but the life we had promised each other. Eventually, the house stood proud and whole, pale yellow with white railings, a small garden in front, each corner reflecting years of effort and love. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and every wall carried memory. I remember imagining Sunday breakfasts with my boys after they grew up, laughter spilling across the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the rooms. I believed in those moments, even when life tested me. Then Laura came into our lives. Jason brought her over one Sunday, full of excitement and pride. I tried to welcome her with warmth, hoping we could build a bridge. At first, I thought her admiration for my home was genuine. But subtle moments told another story, the way she rearranged furniture, replaced curtains, and moved family photos to make space for herself. At the time, I told myself it was harmless. Perhaps she just wanted to feel comfortable. I began to notice a change in Jason, too. He became hesitant to defend me, eager to smooth over tensions, almost apologetic when I raised concerns. The little things I had once brushed aside now gnawed at me, a moved plant here, a rearranged kitchen shelf there. I felt myself slipping from the center of my own home, replaced by someone who didn't understand the history, the sacrifices, or the love that built this place. And yet, as painful as it was, I clung to hope. Hope that respect and family ties could prevail. Hope that my sons, raised with love and values, too would remember where they came from. But I knew deep down that one day, a choice would come, a moment when I would have to stand firm. Not just for the house, but for my dignity. The small irritations started almost imperceptibly. At first, it was Laura moving a few garden pots, or shifting the photos I had displayed for years. I told myself to be patient, to understand that she wanted to make the house her own. But each change felt like a silent message that my presence and history mattered less than her comfort. Jason began defending her, even over the smallest matters. When I tried to explain that certain spaces carried memories, he reminded me gently that it was her home too now. I understood what he meant, but it felt like a betrayal. The boy I had taught about loyalty, kindness, and respect seemed to have forgotten the values I had poured into him. Each time he stayed silent while I struggled to make my voice heard, my heart sank a little further. I started noticing patterns. Laura would invite friends over without telling me. They would sit in my living room, laughing and sipping coffee, oblivious to my presence, as if I were invisible. I watched Jason smile politely, nodding along, trying to avoid conflict. I realized that my home, the place I had nurtured with my hands and my heart, was becoming a stage for someone else's rules. One Thursday morning, the breaking point arrived. I had gone out to the market early, returning with fresh vegetables and flowers. My garden, the one place I went for peace, looked unfamiliar. Roses I had planted for Tom had been moved, lilies uprooted and stacked against the fence. Laura was smiling, proud of what she had accomplished. Seeing it as an improvement, my chest tightened as disbelief and heartbreak collided. I thought about how Jason stood beside her, his eyes avoiding mine, unwilling to intervene. That moment made it painfully clear that my son had chosen sides. I felt a deep, almost physical ache. It wasn't just about flowers or plants, it was about respect, about acknowledgement, about the legacy of love I had built. And I realized then that no gentle explanation or quiet plea would be enough. Something had to change. I remembered all those years of sacrifice. The long nights working double shifts. The tiny victories of watching my boys grow happy and healthy. This home was not just walls, it was the culmination of a lifetime of effort and love. To lose control. To feel sidelined in my own house. It was more than painful. It was a threat to my sense of self. For a long moment, I simply stood there, hands brushing against the counter, heart pounding, mind racing. I thought about Tom and the dreams we had shared. I thought about the boys as children, and how fiercely I had protected them. And I realized that protecting my home and my dignity was no longer optional. I would have to act. Even if it meant confronting not just Laura, but Jason as well. That day, I understood a hard truth: love doesn't always mean yielding. Sometimes love means setting boundaries. Even with your own family. And in that moment of quiet resolve, I knew I had reached the edge of patience. I would need to reclaim what was mine. But I had to do it with the same grace and strength that had carried me through decades of challenge. I knew that moment had come when standing still was no longer an option. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the phone to call a locksmith. But inside I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. This wasn't about anger or revenge, it was about reclaiming the dignity that had been slowly stripped from me. I reminded myself that this house carried the memory of every sacrifice, every tear, every joyful moment I had poured into it. It deserved respect. And so did I. The locksmith arrived in the late afternoon. A kind-faced man with rough hands that told me he understood the weight of life's challenges. I explained the situation briefly, leaving out the anger and letting the facts speak. As he nodded and worked, I felt a quiet sense of authority returning to me. I wasn't just a mother, I was the one who had built this home. And now I would protect it. When Jason and Laura returned that evening, they found the door locked. I could hear their confusion, their raised voices drifting through the night. But I stayed calm. I didn't yell. I didn't try to justify my actions. I simply let them face the consequence of crossing boundaries that had been ignored for far too long. In that silence, I felt something I hadn't in months: control. Power wasn't in domination, it was in standing firm and not letting anyone diminish me. The following day, Laura called, her voice trembling in a way that made me realize she had finally understood the seriousness of the situation. She admitted, in her own hesitant way, that she had overstepped, that she had imposed her comfort on a home that was not hers to redesign or claim. And Jason, exhausted and caught between loyalty to his wife and the mother who raised him, reached out separately. His words carried remorse and a desire to reconnect, to remember the values I had instilled in him. I listened quietly, letting them speak. While I reflected on all that had brought me here, all the long nights, the grief, the joys, and the heartbreaks, everything had led to this moment of clarity. I realized that asserting myself wasn't cruel, it was necessary. It wasn't about punishing anyone, but about making sure respect was no longer optional in my home. Over the next few days, conversations were careful and deliberate. Laura agreed to come alone, to apologize properly, and to learn what it meant to coexist respectfully. Jason began seeing that loyalty and love were meaningless if they came at the cost of ignoring boundaries. Together, we began to rebuild not just the routines of a household, but the understanding of what family truly meant. That evening, after the first quiet day back in control of my home, I sat in the kitchen and let myself breathe. The house still looked the same, yet everything felt different. There was space for peace, for reflection, for love that didn't demand sacrifice beyond reason. I realized that sometimes, reclaiming what's rightfully yours requires courage and firmness, even with the people you love most. I understood then that boundaries are not walls to keep people out, They are bridges that allow connection to thrive safely. And in that knowledge, I felt a strength deeper than any I had known before. A quiet resilience that came from knowing I had finally taken a stand for myself and for the legacy of love embedded in this home. In the days that followed, the house slowly began to feel like mine again, not just the walls and floors, but the energy, the warmth, and the quiet respect that had been missing. Laura arrived, holding a small bouquet of lilies, my favorite. And for the first time, I could see genuine remorse in her eyes. She admitted, in a way that felt both fragile and sincere, that she had overstepped and that her actions had forced Jason to choose sides unfairly. I listened to her quietly, feeling the weight of months of tension lift little by little. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about creating space for change, for understanding, and for rebuilding trust. Jason, too, began to speak differently, reflecting on how he had allowed someone else to overshadow the values I had instilled in him. He admitted the guilt he had carried, the confusion he had felt between loyalty to his wife and love for me. Together, we began establishing new routines, small acts that rebuilt the connections we had lost. Sundays became sacred again, with shared breakfasts, quiet conversations, and laughter echoing through the kitchen. Laura asked permission before changing anything, even the smallest arrangement in the garden. And Jason would sit beside me, helping and listening in ways he had forgotten were important. In those moments, I realized that healing wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about consistency, patience, and the quiet decisions we make every day to honor one another. The home, once a battlefield of emotions, became a place of reconciliation, a reminder that respect and love can coexist when boundaries are acknowledged and upheld. I also noticed subtle shifts in myself. I felt lighter, more confident, and more connected to my own strength. I could enjoy my home fully, knowing that my history and my sacrifices were recognized and valued. This peace wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the result of courage, of choosing to stand firm, and of teaching the people I love the importance of respect. I often reflect on those weeks of tension and the moments when I felt unseen. They taught me that even in family, love is not a guarantee of respect. It must be nurtured and protected. And sometimes, standing alone to assert that truth is the most loving thing we can do, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. As the sun set over the porch one evening, I realized that our house had become more than a home again. It was a symbol of perseverance, patience, and the quiet strength that carries us through life's hardest tests. And for the first time in a long while, I felt fully at peace. Looking back, I understand now that the hardest lessons often come wrapped in heartbreak and challenge. I learned that love alone isn't enough to sustain respect. It has to be nurtured, guarded, and sometimes asserted with courage, even when it feels uncomfortable. Standing firm in my home wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of self-respect. And ultimately, an act of love for my family, teaching them the importance of boundaries and dignity. I also realized that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means creating space for change, for growth, and for trust to be rebuilt. Watching Jason and Laura learn, reflect, and adjust their actions reminded me that true family connection requires patience, communication, and empathy. If my story resonates with you, I hope it encourages you to stand up for yourself in the places where respect matters most. Remember, your home, your values, and your peace of mind are worth protecting. And sometimes, the strongest way to show love is by teaching others how to treat you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How would you handle a situation like this? Share your experiences in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, Please like and share it so others can reflect on the importance of respect and family boundaries.